blindly repeat what is being told, but we also sort of examine these policy decisions in a critical way, so that we basically we give our readers a perspective on whether what's happening is appropriate or not. So, what were some of the challenges we journalists faced while covering this? There are obviously quite a few, but I will dwell only on a couple of them because I have 20 minutes. So, the first challenge I want to talk about is communicating the science when it reverses completely. Okay. So, in other words, a scientific fact at the beginning of the pandemic has undergone basically a 180-degree transformation by the end of the pandemic, or 1 or 2 years later. Now, this can happen due to multiple reasons. Either the science itself can change, the science evolves, or the science can be miscommunicated at the beginning of the pandemic. Towards the end, it becomes clearer, so it looks like everything has changed. Or it looks like the science has changed, but it hasn't really. Again, it's more of a communication issue. Now, this is a challenge because it erodes faith in science and causes causes confusion amongst lay people. So, for instance, if at the beginning of the pandemic you're saying something with great confidence, and at the end of it you're saying, "Oh, look, this is completely different," and people are going to ask, do you even know what you're talking about? So let me give you some examples. So one example of where the science changed, both the science changed and there was imperfect communication in the beginning, was when globally respected scientific agencies like the CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control in the USA, and the World Health Organization, were telling everybody in 2020, when the pandemic started, that everyone doesn't need to wear face masks. Only healthcare workers like doctors and nurses need it, or sick people need to wear it. The rest of them don't need masks. Okay, so that was initially the communication from all these ages. In fact, lay persons were actively discouraged from wearing the mask. Now, later we came to know that the Centers for Disease Control was saying this because there was a shortage of N95 masks at the beginning of the pandemic. So suddenly the demand for masks went through the air, went through the roof. So there weren't enough N95 masks to go around, and therefore, instead of directly saying that we do not have enough masks for the entire community, the CDC chose to say you don't need masks. Lay persons don't need masks, only healthcare workers. They were just trying to preserve the masks, right? So that was the initial communication. Now, over 2 years later, we do have more science. We have had a couple of randomized controlled trials. I don't know how many of you know what a randomized controlled trial is, but basically people actually compared groups of people wearing masks with groups of people wearing without. There was a really big randomized trial in Bangladesh to see if masks can reduce transmission of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And those trials told us a lot about how effective masks are. And what we know today is fairly nuanced. We know that the best mask for a virus like SARS-CoV-2 is an N95 mask, followed by a surgical mask, basically medical grade masks. We also suspect that the cloth masks are not really that effective. This is what we know today. Now, if you remember initially when we were told that the community, regular people don't need to wear masks, only healthcare workers need to wear masks. Later on, it changed a little, saying everybody can wear cloth masks. If you don't have N95 masks, just wear cloth masks, right? Today, we know that the best masks to be used are really medical grade masks, okay? Sorry. So as you can see, in this case, the science evolved. We did more studies. We learned more about the effectiveness of masks. And also, the communication of science was a little bit political, right? Organizations like CDC, they weren't really accurately telling us what they knew. What they knew was that masks do work, are likely to work, but they were also factoring in the fact that they didn't want everybody to buy the masks. so what they were saying is that, look, masks don't work for regular people, they work only for doctors and nurses. Okay, so this was one of this, what I call a 180-degree reversal over the pandemic. So how do journalists communicate this, right? You're going and telling everybody, oh, hey, wear masks, and you're shaming people for not wearing masks. And then suddenly you're saying, well, hey, cloth masks don't really work very well, but we were forcing you to wear masks. Okay, so this is a challenge. And it's a challenge we should all keep in mind. It's not going to go away. This is going to happen with every pandemic. Science changes. And I cannot think of any way to address this except to be aware of the fact that science is never absolute, right? We need to understand that, science is a process. We learn new things every day, and especially in a pandemic situation where it's a new virus, where we've never looked at masks as a public health policy before. A lot is changing. We're learning so much more. So that awareness at the beginning helps us communicate with a little bit of, we need to be a little more circumspect in communicating, right? You say, right now, the best we know is that masks may be useful, so please wear masks. So I think it's helpful not to convey science as something absolute. So that's a challenge I face, and this is what I feel is the solution. Another scientific change that claim that changed dramatically was about how COVID is transmitted, how the SARS-CoV-2 virus is transmitted. Okay. Initially, several public health agencies told us that COVID spreads through droplets. It's so-called droplet transmission, which happens only within a 3 feet distance. Okay, so we were told that as long as you maintain distance from people, you're safe. There's a 6 feet distance, and also we believed that surface transmission was extremely important. Okay, so basically, if the virus is on a surface and you go and touch it, then it's very easy to contract the virus that way. There's also known as so-called Formite mediated transmission. And this belief led to most public places being sanitized endlessly, a phenomenon that people began referring to as hygiene theater, right? People would just endlessly scrub surfaces with bleach, and as soon as it still happens in my building, like somebody completes their isolation period after COVID, then the whole place is like cleaned out with bleach and all the surfaces are clean, etc. Right? That was based on the belief that SARS-CoV-2 primarily gets transmitted through large droplets. Today, in 2022, our understanding is different. Okay, we know today that COVID doesn't spread mainly through. We know that COVID is far more dangerous. It spreads through aerosol transmission, airborne transmission. What does that mean? It means that tiny particles can linger in the air for a long period of time, and they can go much farther than 5 feet, right? And we also know that surface transmission actually does not play such a big role in COVID spreading in community settings. So I'm distinguishing between community settings and between hospitals. Community settings, all of us here, me touching a surface which you have touched is not necessarily the top way, the top mode of transmission. The top mode of transmission is through the air, right? And therefore, this need to endlessly sanitize surfaces is probably not such an important public health strategy today. What is an important public health strategy is ventilation, keeping doors and windows open, high efficiency particulate filters, and masks that protect against airborne transmission, basically N95 masks. Or if you don't have them, then surgical masks, medical grade masks. Cloth masks, probably not so much. Maybe someday we'll discover that they do work, but right now we don't have that much evidence for it. So this was another scenario where the science again changed sort of 180 degrees during the pandemic. And I'll discuss one last example. Again, in the case of airborne transmission, again it was a case of a little bit of miscommunication. There's a lot of journalism out there about what exactly happened. The definition of airborne transmission itself, airborne transmission was poorly defined for a really long time. So, which is why people kept saying there is no airborne transmission in COVID, but actually it turned out there is. So I would encourage you to go and find, there are some really good articles by a journalist called Roxanne Kamsi, and there's an article in The Wired about this entire controversy about airborne transmission. So those are two things that changed. A third example of science that looks like it's changed but hasn't really changed, it looks like it's changed because of communication, is treatment reversals. Okay, so let me tell you what I mean. So you may all know that in the initial days of the COVID pandemic, convalescent plasma, which is I hope everybody here knows what that is, but convalescent plasma was thought to be a very important treatment for COVID. It's basically blood with the RBC cells removed. And the idea was that if somebody has recovered from COVID and if you take plasma from them, because it has antibodies, and then you transfuse them into a person who is sick, then the antibodies will prevent them from getting worse. So initially, it was believed that it was a really important treatment, and people were running from pillar to post trying to get convalescent plasma, right? What happened in those days initially was actually there was not much evidence for convalescent plasma. So the initial hype was actually not supported by evidence. So even though people were running around, etc., that probably shouldn't have happened, right? Then subsequently, we had a number of randomized controlled trials that actually tested convalescent plasma in patients. Does it really work in preventing people from getting worse in severe and moderate cases? Okay, so I hope you all know the difference between mild, moderate, and severe. Mild is very early stage COVID, just fever, no respiratory issues. From moderate onwards, you need oxygen and you may need hospitalization. And all these trials checked if convalescent plasma works in moderately and severely ill patients, and they found that it does not, right? And then suddenly the news cycle was dominated by news that convalescent plasma doesn't work, right? It's useless. Don't run after it. Don't waste your money. Don't waste your time. Now, again, we have come to a situation where a few studies have shown that convalescent plasma does work in mild COVID, which is if you give somebody plasma within 36 hours, or let's say 2 or 3 days, before they progress to the stage where they need oxygen, then, there is a benefit from convalescent plasma. Now, for somebody who is not understanding these nuances, it might look like initially you're saying, hey, convalescent plasma is like the magic bullet. Then you're saying, oh, it's crap, doesn't work. And then suddenly you're saying again that it's working, right? This is not what I call a medical reversal, but this is more of, again, imperfect communication, because initially we were saying it worked without evidence. A lot of doctors were saying it worked without evidence. That's sort of unfortunate. Even the Indian Council of Medical Research was saying it worked without evidence. Then when the clinical trial showed it doesn't work in moderate and severe cases, we said, oh, it's crap, but that's not true. I mean, the right way to communicate it would be to say that it does not work in severe cases. And now when it's back, we're saying, oh, what I'm trying to say is you're painting it as a medical reversal, whereas it isn't. So, so again, all these are some of the challenges. Like how do you communicate to people that science is an evolving process? Things change. It's because I guess in general we are all taught to communicate, taught to portray science as something absolute, right? You say science says so, and therefore you need to listen to me. But the truth is that there is a substantial amount of uncertainty in science, especially in a pandemic situation. And I guess that is the key to dealing with such situations. Actually, being honest about the fact that we don't know. So, so that was the first challenge, how, what to do when science changes 180 degrees. A second challenge for journalists, and I believe there are quite a few students of mass communication here and a few working journalists, so this may resonate with them. But one of the challenges I faced was how to find the right experts to speak to while writing a story, okay? So the kind of stories I report on are usually how science affects policy, like how it affects daily life, how it affects, not really science in isolation. Like I typically will not write about a study that found that a particular drug worked against the SARS-CoV-2 virus in mice. I will not write about that. I'm more likely to write about a drug that is commercialized and being used in public. So I write about the intersection between science and society. And in this situation, we need to speak to people across multiple areas of expertise, right? And all these areas of expertise can be really, really niche and very different from each other, something which, as journalists, we don't always realize. So for instance, if I'm supposed to write about a vaccine development program, so I wrote extensively about the Covaxin development program, and pretty much everything else. We need to talk initially to scientists who are well versed in the early stages of vaccine development, which is basically virologists, immunologists, etc., right? Then when we move on to human clinical trials, that's a completely different area of expertise, right? You need epidemiologists, you need people who design trials, who can understand the data generated from the trials, and who can analyze the results. You need experts in bioethics, because human clinical trials have a very strong bioethical component. You need somebody overseeing, you need to make sure that the trial participants' rights are protected. That's an especially important aspect in a country like India, where most people are medically illiterate, so you need to make sure that vulnerable groups are not exploited. And then when you write about vaccine manufacturing, you need to speak to a different kind of expert in an area known as good manufacturing practices. Now that's a completely different area of expertise. Like a virologist or immunologist who's aware of early stages of vaccine development might actually not understand anything about good manufacturing practices. They may broadly understand what's going on, but they are really not the right person to speak to. You need somebody who is sort of living and breathing the subject. Then you come to the commercialization of the drug, the point where the drug is actually approved by the drug regulator for use in the population. At this point of time, you need somebody with expertise in the drug regulatory system, the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. So you need lawyers, you need, again, pharmaceutical consultants, different area of expertise. So journalists need access to this entire range of experts to fully understand the process. And that can be somewhat difficult to find, especially in some areas. You may find that such experts are not even there in our country, because COVID-19 was the first time India did such large-scale clinical trials. So for instance, the Covaxin trial of 26,000 participants is the biggest trial ever conducted in this country, right? And so there's very few small pockets of scientists who actually have experience in designing, conducting, and analyzing clinical trials. So you may actually need to step out of the country if you want a very specific comment on the nitty-gritties of clinical trials. So that was certainly a challenge for me. Luckily, I'm not a newspaper journalist with extremely tight deadlines who has to publish breaking news every day. So I was able to make an effort to reach out to experts and read the literature, etc. In general, it's certainly worthwhile to find the right expert to comment on your niche, because one of the pitfalls of journalism is that you may assume that a clinician or a practicing doctor is the right person to talk about the design of a clinical trial, and you may be completely wrong about that, because we don't realize it, but these are very, very specialized areas of expertise, and you may end up misleading your readers, right? If you go and speak to somebody else who doesn't understand and say, hey, is this a well-designed clinical trial? Has it really shown what it claims to show? And that person might tell you yes, and you may think they're right because they are in the medical field. But the answer is no, because they are in the medical field, but the medical field is a vast field. There are many, many, many specializations. So I think journalists can bring great value to public discourse by identifying the right experts to answer questions. In contrast, they can do a great disservice by talking to the wrong experts or amplifying incorrect information. And I realize that the challenge of identifying the right expertise is difficult in daily journalism given the tight timelines, but it is still well worth doing this. I think this is the way sort of to go ahead. I don't know if I've taken up all my time, but that's all I have.